Hey, first grade friends, welcome back for a brand new chapter book today. I hope you enjoyed Charlotte's Web and that story, but today we are going to be reading my number one all-time favorite chapter book. I listened to the story when I was younger. I read it, I think my first time reading it was in fourth grade, and now I've read it as an adult probably 30 or 40 times, and it is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, written by Roald Dahl. Roald Dahl has written many famous chapter books. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the BFG, James and the Giant Peach, or some of his very popular ones. Matilda is another one. He's written many books, and his books have been so popular that they've been turned into movies as well. So, you've probably heard the story before, or at least you've seen the movie. There's two different movies for this. The original movie was called Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and that was made in 1971. And then there was a remade version called Charlie and the Chocolate Factory in 2005. And both movies are very different, and both movies are still very different from what happens in the book. So when we read the book, I want you to listen for some clues, but also remember, this book was written in 1964. Okay, 56 years ago. Things were a little bit different back then, and things didn't cost as much money as they do now. So when you hear them talk about how much a candy bar cost, you'll be a little surprised. Okay, but that was true in 1964. All right, here we go. Let's read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Chapter number 1 says, "Here comes Charlie." These two very old people are the father and mother of Mr. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. So at the beginning of the book, you are going to meet all the characters. And these two very old people are the father and mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. This is Mr. Bucket. This is Mrs. Bucket. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket have one small boy whose name is Charlie Bucket. This is Charlie. How do you do? And how do you do? And how do you do again? He is very pleased to meet you. So there's all the characters. The whole of this family, the 6 grown-ups, count them, Grandpa George, Grandma Georgina, Grandpa Joe, Grandma Josephine, Mr. Bucket, Mrs. Bucket, and Charlie, so there's 7 people. The whole of this family, the 6 grown-ups, and little Charlie Bucket lived together in a small wooden house on the edge of a great town. The house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable for them all. There was only 2 rooms in the place altogether, and there was only 1 bed. The bed was given to the 4 old grandparents because they were so old and tired. They were so tired they never got out of it. Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine on this side, Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina on this side. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and little Charlie Bucket slept in the other room upon a mattress on the floor. In the summertime, this wasn't so bad but in the winter, freezing cold drafts blew across the floor all night long, and it was awful. There wasn't any question of them being able to buy a better house or even one more bed to sleep in. They were far too poor for that. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family with a job. He worked in a toothpaste factory where he sat all day long at a bench and screwed little caps on the tops of the tubes of toothpaste after the tubes had been filled. But a toothpaste cap screwer is never paid very much money, and poor Mr. Bucket, however hard he worked and however fast he screwed on the caps, was never able to make enough to buy 1/2 of the things that so large a family needed. There wasn't even enough money to buy proper food for them all. The only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup for supper. Sundays were a little bit better. They all looked forward to Sundays because then, although they had exactly the same, everyone was allowed a second helping. The Buckets, of course, didn't starve, but every one of them, the two old grandfathers, the two old grandmothers, Charlie's father, Charlie's mother, and especially little Charlie himself, went from morning till night with a horrible, empty feeling in their tummy. Charlie felt it worst of all, and although his father and mother often went without their own share of lunch or supper so that they could give it to him, it still wasn't nearly enough for a growing boy. He desperately wanted something more filling and satisfying than cabbage and cabbage soup. The one thing he longed for more than anything else was chocolate. Walking to school in the mornings, Charlie could see great slabs of chocolate piled up high in shop windows, and he would stop and stare and press his nose against the glass, his mouth watering like mad. Many times a day, he would see other children taking creamy candy bars out of their pockets and munching them greedily, and that, of course, was pure torture. Only once a year on his birthday did Charlie Bucket ever get to taste a bit of chocolate. The whole family saved up their money for that special occasion, and when the great day arrived, Charlie was always presented with one small chocolate bar to eat all by himself. And each time he received it, on those marvelous birthday mornings, he would place it carefully in a small wooden box that he owned and treasure it as though it were a bar of solid gold. And for the next few days, he would allow himself only to look at it, but never touch it. Then at last, when he could stand it no longer, he would peel back a tiny bit of the paper wrapping on one corner to expose a tiny bit of chocolate, and then he would take a tiny nibble, just enough to allow the lovely sweet taste to spread out slowly over his tongue. The next day, he would take another tiny nibble, and so on, and in this way, Charlie would make his 10-cent bar of birthday chocolate last him for more than a month. But I haven't told you about the one awful thing that tortured little Charlie, the lover of chocolate, more than anything else. This thing for him was far, far worse than seeing slabs of chocolate in the shop windows or watching other children munching creamy candy bars right in front of him. It was the most terrible, torturing thing that you could imagine, and it was this. In the town itself, actually within sight of the house in which Charlie lived, there was an enormous chocolate factory. Just imagine that. And it wasn't simply an ordinary enormous chocolate factory either. It was the largest and most famous in the whole world. It was Wonka's factory, owned by a man called Mr. Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolates that there had ever been. And what a tremendous, marvelous place it was. It had huge iron gates leading into it, and a high wall surrounding it, and smoke belching from its chimneys, and strange whizzing sounds coming up from deep inside. And outside the walls, for half a mile around in every direction, the air was scented with the heavy, rich smell of melting chocolate. Twice a day on his way home from school, little Charlie Bucket had to walk right past the gates of the factory. And every time he went by, he would begin to walk very, very slowly, and he would hold his nose high in the air and take deep, long sniffs of the gorgeous chocolatey smell all around him. Oh, how he loved that smell, and oh, how he wished he could go inside the factory and see what it was like. And that is the end of chapter 1. Just imagine, try to visualize in your brain, if you were little Charlie, you barely had any food to eat every day. You were really skinny and hungry all the time. And you had to eat the same kind of gross food every day. And then you lived right next to a chocolate factory, and every time you walked by it, all you could smell was chocolate. Oh, that would be torture. All right, when we read chapter 2 next time, we're going to learn a little bit more about Mr. Willy Wonka's factory. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.